Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations with artists, writers, and curators. My name is Mike Sakazagawa, and this is episode 60. Today's guest is Brenda Biondo. Hey there, folks. How's it going? So, if you've listened before, you know that I always ask the guests about pieces of art and culture that they've taken in recently that matter to them. And, that's on my mind a bit because, well, I went and saw Black Panther for a second time this past weekend, and man, that is a good movie. And, there's a lot to say about that movie, and a lot of people have already said a lot of much smarter things than I could about it. So I'm not going to turn this into an in-depth review or think piece, although there are a lot of good ones out there, and they're not too hard to find if you're so inclined. I do love the conversation that's happening around that movie for, all of its complexity and nuance and range of opinions. Mostly, though, I just really enjoyed watching that movie. It was just a fun, good, well-written, amazingly cast movie, and it has made a ton of money, and rightly so. And I really just love that it's a genre movie, too, I mean, not to say that it doesn't also matter to me to see people of color making prestige dramas or highbrow literature, but I think it's pretty undeniable that popular genres have a much broader reach and appeal and make up a bigger piece of this sort of larger cultural picture. So it's really heartening to me to see a movie like this doing well and being good. And, that's something I've been thinking about a lot with respect to my reading the last couple years as well. I read pretty widely, and definitely some of the most important books to me in the last few years have been literary novels that were written by people of color. If you heard my conversation with Celeste Ng, for example, you'll have heard me gush about how much her first book meant to me. So, yeah, literary fiction matters to me a lot. But I think what has been even more heartening to me has been seeing diverse genre fiction. The last 2 or 3 years, it's turned out that almost all of my favorite science fiction and fantasy novels have been written by people of color and women and LGBTQ authors and have featured characters of color and women characters and LGBTQ characters, whether it's been, something like Daniel J. Older's Shadow Shaper or N.K. Jemison's Broken Earth trilogy or, Sarah Gailey's River of Teeth novellas, which, we might have heard me talk about on the show, Ken Liu or J.Y. Yang or Sophia Samatar, or right now I'm reading Rivers Solomon's debut novel. It's called An Unkindness of Ghosts, and it's just fantastic. And, science fiction and fantasy novels like these just didn't get published when I was a kid, or, there were some, but they were pretty few and far between. And I guess what I'm saying is, it's just a great time for genre fiction and genre movies, and I'm just thrilled to get to see it. So how about you? What are you excited about these days? Tweet at me, @ChannelOpenPod. Let me know. All right, on to today's show. Brenda Biondo is a photographer whose work focuses on 3 distinct areas: constructed abstractions centered on atmospheric color and light, conservation and land-based issues, and the way that cultural artifacts move from the past into the present. Brenda's work has been exhibited in shows throughout the country and published in numerous print and online publications, including the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Denver Post, and Lens Scratch. Her photographs are in the collections at the Library of Congress, the Museum of Photographic Arts, and numerous corporations and private collections. A solo exhibit of her work opened at the San Diego Museum of Art in July 2017. Her book of photographs, Once Upon a Playground, was published by the University Press of New England in 2014 and is now the subject of a 5-year traveling exhibit organized by Exhibits USA. Now, as you'll hear in the conversation, Brenda and I met when we were both participating in a group artist presentation a few years ago. What I loved about the work that Brenda was presenting back then, her Once Upon a Playground series, is how it engaged with history and this feeling of nostalgia that I had for the subject matter, but with this strong sort of modernist visual aesthetic that just worked perfectly for me. And then I was lucky enough to catch her exhibition at the San Diego Museum of Art last year, where the Playground series was paired with a newer series of abstracts called Paper Skies. And that second series took the modernist sensibility and really took it to the next level, and it had this really fascinating underlying conceptual approach. You'll hear more about that in the conversation as well. So yeah, I was just really happy to get the chance to talk with her for the show. So in our conversation, Brenda and I discussed 4 of her bodies of work: Once Upon a Playground and Paper Skies, which I mentioned, and then also one called Remnants and Revival, and another called Modalities. I put links to all of them in the show notes, so do check those out. Just, take a few minutes and take a look. It'll give you a lot more context for the conversation. Also, the book that I mentioned, Brenda's book, Once Upon a Playground, I highly recommend that as well, and I've put some links in the show notes to where you can order it. All right, so let's get started. As always, if you'd like to join in the conversation, you can use the hashtag ChannelOpenPod on Twitter. And now here's my conversation with Brenda Biondo. One of the things I always do before I talk to someone is try to remember the first time that I sort of became aware of their work. And with you, it's a pretty easy one because we both presented at the Open Show at Medium Festival in 2014. So that was, and you were presenting your Once Upon a Playground series. I believe your book had just come out at that time. Is that right?
I think so, yeah. The book came out in May of 2014, so that sounds about right.
Yeah,
and
that would have been October. Yeah. But yeah, I remember, so like you were the first one in our little group of 4 to present, and I remember being really, really struck by your work and also the way that you talked about it. So I was happy to have the time to talk to you. And then, of course, just recently, this past year at the Medium Festival, I got to see you speak again, that you have your exhibition at the San Diego Museum of Art. Is that still up, or?
It's up for 3 more days, actually. It had a 6-month run, which I was really excited about, among other things.
So unfortunately, by the time this goes out, it won't be up anymore.
Right, it'll be down.
Yeah. But that was cool, getting to see your work in a museum and getting to see you talk about it, and also getting to hear Ariel talk about the sort of curation process was really neat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the whole thing was just a fabulous experience for me.
Yeah. It seems like things have been going pretty well for you artistically, but one thing that I think is sort of interesting is I think that this is right, that your work, your Once Upon a Playground series took a really long time to develop. Is that right? It was about what?
It is. Well, it was turned into a 10-year project, which I never expected it to go that long. But it was the first project I started on after I switched to photography full-time in, I think it was 2004. So I had just turned 40 and just had my first kid. And I had been taking pictures all my life, but I had a journalism degree and I was working as a freelance writer at that time. And before that, I was in corporate communications. But I had been doing photography ever since I was 15, and my dad was a photographer. And I just had always wanted it to be my career. And I decided back at age 40 that it was finally time for me to do that. So I was at a playground one day with my daughter, who was a baby, and soon after I made that decision. And, I was looking around me and I noticed the old playground equipment and thought about, that might end up being a good project. But I never, expected it to turn into such a long project. I ended up shooting for 7 years and doing other projects in there as well. And then deciding to make a book out of it, and then looking for a publisher, and then finally finding a publisher. And now it's in a 5-year traveling exhibit organized by Exhibits USA. So it turned out to be a really great project for me, but I don't think I was intending to spend 10 years on playgrounds. But I'm happy. And, obviously in the end, I'm happy with all of it.
Yeah. It's kind of funny because I feel like, a lot of people often have this impression that, that somebody can be sort of come out of nowhere. And that sort of tends to elide the massive amount of work that goes into coming out of nowhere,
Right. And I mean, it takes all this momentum. It just, every year, you network a little bit more, you get better at what you do. I had to teach myself the art industry, because even I took one fine art photography course back in college, so 30 years ago, and one photojournalism course, and that was it as far as my formal education. And then my dad, was a photographer, but once I decided to make it a career, I didn't have an MFA. I didn't have a network of people, other photographers, other artists, in, teaching myself to, retrain my eye and to print and how, galleries work and how all that works. It was a really, really long, steep learning curve. And it was, pretty stressful in the beginning, especially with two little kids at home and, trying to just get myself established. But especially in the last few years, I've been, so happy with the momentum. Like I said, every year my career progresses a little bit further. And so I'm really happy. As long as I can see that progress every year, I'm pretty happy with things.
Yeah. One of the things that, for me, there's a little bit of an intersection with my work. I kind of feel like, because at least with this project, sort of, is very evocative of childhood and has a sort of nostalgic feel. I think especially for people that are sort of over a certain age, maybe the younger people might not be able to have that same feeling about the kinds of playgrounds that you're preserving in your images.
Right. Mm-hmm. When I show it when people see the book or they see it in an exhibit or they see it online, they really get kind of happy about seeing these old pieces of equipment that they remember from their childhood. And these are the classic wooden and metal playground equipment that was installed like from the early 1900s through the 1970s. And so it's a really big part of American culture, and it's a big part of people's childhood, especially their fond memories of being out there with their friends. And for me, one of the things I was happy about with this project was the chance to document something that was disappearing, because as far as I can tell, nobody's collecting the old equipment. The Smithsonian's not collecting it. Nobody else seems to be interested in preserving it. But I thought it would be good at least to preserve it in photos, if, not in physical form.
Yeah. And in your book, your book actually includes a lot more than just the images. You sort of go into sort of the history of these structures and how they sort of played into this sort of moment in America when they were coming out, which I think is really interesting. One of the things that I sort of think about with this work is sort of the difference between history and nostalgia. I think sometimes those can feel similar to people, especially if you lived through these moments. But to me, when I think about it, they actually seem very different.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, everybody has their own personal memories, so it's part of their personal histories. But I didn't really realize until I started the project how big a part of Americana and American culture playgrounds played, what their role was. I just really never thought of it. And then when I was doing research for the project, I discovered that the playground started in the early 1900s in the inner cities to keep poor and immigrant children off the streets and out of trouble and help mold them into good American citizens. So there's all this history I had no idea about when I started the project. And so that made it even more interesting. And then I think what people also like about the book is that at the same time I was shooting, I was collecting old playground catalogs that manufacturers used to print and send out to towns and schools around the country, and so to sell their wares. So I have playground catalogs from like 1916 through the 70s. So in the book, I've matched the images. Like if I've shot a piece, like a certain type of equipment, I go through my catalogs and I try to find that exact piece of equipment in one of my old catalogs. So in the book, they're positioned next to each other, and I think people have enjoyed seeing that sense of understanding, that sense of history through the old images and the contemporary photographs.
Yeah. It's something that I think is really a neat experience, being sort of able to connect your own sort of personal history and personal story to that. Having this additional context allows you to sort of understand your own story in a different sort of as part of something bigger than just yourself. I find that really fascinating.
Yeah, I do too. I mean, you're able to get context for your own experience and see how it fits into the experience of the country. And even one of the things that was interesting when I was shooting and working on the book was how the equipment that was installed during different periods of time kind of reflected what was going on in society at that time. Like in the 1960s, so much equipment in the shape of space equipment, like satellites and rocket ships, because everybody was just crazy about the U.S. Space program at that time. And Cowboys and Indians and Cinderella and all that, all those pop culture references are visible in the playground equipment, which is really kind of odd, but interesting.
Yeah. So it's sort of thinking about the Once Upon a Playground as, you know, the photographs themselves as an act of preservation. It's sort of interesting then to consider. I wasn't really as familiar with this next body of work because, you know, it was really mostly the abstracts and then the playground work that I had known more. But this Remnants and Revival, I took the opportunity to look through your website and sort of check that out as well. Where here you're talking about land use and land preservation, and this is also sort of drawing on sort of your journalistic experience, it seems like as well. It says in your bio that when you were freelance writing, you're primarily writing about environmental issues. Is that right?
That is right. Yeah, that's a big interest of mine. And I almost didn't switch to photography because I felt like since I was writing about environmental subjects, especially, you know, more than a decade ago when there wasn't as much environmental writing, I felt like that was making a contribution and it was important. And when I was thinking about making this switch and concentrating on photography, I really couldn't figure out how I was going to do that and still keep the focus on environmental and conservation issues, because I didn't want to be just a straight documentary photographer. I didn't want to go take pictures of clear-cut forests and stuff like that. But I wanted to continue focusing on something that I thought was socially relevant. So I actually put off switching to photography for a couple of years because I couldn't figure that out. And then finally I just decided, you know, I'm going to make the switch because I think I'm a better photographer. I can be a better photographer than I am a writer. And I was a good writer. I mean, I was getting published in the Washington Post and Denver Post and Nature Conservancy magazine and stuff like that. But I thought I was naturally a better photographer. I mean, writing for me was really, really hard. I'm really good at organizing information and picking out information, but I didn't feel like I had a creative voice to my writing. And I didn't feel that way with photography. It was very easy. It came naturally. I loved doing it. It didn't feel like work. And so I wanted to make that switch. And I just told myself, look, okay, you haven't figured it all out. Just make the switch and then give yourself a little time to see how you can focus on environmental and other issues that are important to you. Because, you know, I wasn't super excited about playgrounds. They're interesting, and obviously once I found out more about them, it was nice to feel like I was helping preserve this part of American culture. But I have other, you know, big interests in land conservation, environmental issues, and I just didn't know how to show that with photography. And so, you know, I think the Remnants and Revival series was an attempt to tie in my interest in that area with my photography. And it's a series, you know, I was happy with. I have future projects and especially book projects that I'm working on that will bring that conservation focus maybe back into my work. But for the current moment, I'm focusing mostly on the abstracts.
It's an interesting thing. It's, you know, that I didn't know that. What you just said about wanting to focus on something that was more socially relevant. I feel like that is a topic that a lot of both writers and artists and just everybody that's creative that I've been talking to recently has been talking a lot about what the role of art ought to be, especially at a time like this when everything is very sort of politically chaotic.
Right.
And everybody, maybe not everybody, but a lot of people feel a real drive or even responsibility to contribute in a positive way. And then, but for people who aren't making work that's sort of more explicitly political or socially relevant, it's often a question like, well, is what I'm doing still matter? Which for me, I kind of think it does, but it's interesting to hear you talk about how that sort of pulled you in that direction to make work that is sort of both artistic and relevant in that way.
Yeah. It's something I struggle with a lot because, I tend to say this. It's like, okay, the abstract work is getting me more recognition in shows and all that, and I love working on it. I think it's interesting, but sometimes I feel like I'm just making pretty pictures, and what am I really contributing to, helping the situation out there? But I think I've made peace with that because, I have two parts. As far as I'm concerned, I have two parts to my photographic practice. That work, the abstract work, which is all about atmospheric light and color, which is also part of the landscape, but it's something that's very important to me. It makes me happy. It's why I live in Colorado, and it's helping move my career forward. And so I'm happy with it, but I also feel like it's important that I have these other projects right now going on in the background. And eventually, I'll push them more to the foreground. Like I have a book project I've been working on for a couple of years about an endangered species and how land use in the Western U.S. has contributed to this problem of this endangered species. And I had to put that book project aside because of the museum show in San Diego and other things that have come up. And so I felt a little bit guilty about that, but I know it's something that I will come back to. I always have too many projects going on, but I'm almost done with that one. So I'm hoping in the next few months I'll have it ready to start showing people. And so yeah, it's important to me. I don't want to, I will always have those two parts of my practice.
It's interesting because for me, I really enjoy your abstract work quite a bit.
Thank you.
And I think that in some ways, even though it's not something that's maybe directly, political or related to conservation or anything like that, I think that there's something sort of contemplative about that, both in the way that you make those images and in the ways that as an audience member, we can sort of take them in. And I find that there's a real value to being able to slow down,
Yeah. No, I do agree with you. And I do understand the value of that type of work as well. Because this other type of work is always hanging in the back of my mind. Sometimes it wears me down a little bit. It's like I want to get to it, but I also, I'm a pretty practical person, especially for an artist, I think. And I know, I've kind of learned about how you can build your career over time and things you need to do and I want to take advantage of opportunities that come up. And so I don't always have the time to put into these other projects that I feel are also worthwhile. But I think I've come, to accept that there's a time for everything. And right now the time is for me to be focusing on this other work. And maybe in a year or less, I'll have some time to make a quick switch and get the other projects underway again. So yeah, it's a constant balancing act. I mean, I know there's a lot of artists that have, what's it called? The dry spell where you're trying to come up with ideas. And I've got the other problem. I've got so many projects I want to start on, and I get stressed because I can't do them all at once. But yeah, I mean, at the same time, everything's going well. So it's not like I want to sit here and whine. I'm very happy how things are going. Try not to whine.
So the abstract works, you've got paper skies, moving pictures, and modalities. And again, it was because of the San Diego Museum show, paper skies is the one that I was most familiar with. But although I've seen you posting a few examples of some of the other ones to Facebook here and there. So these are pictures, the way you described them in your artist lecture this, past fall, is you're taking photographs of of the sky and then cutting them and folding them and then rephotographing them against the sky to sort of make these abstract images, which first of all, just as a process, I find that really fascinating. And then how the results are often very reminiscent of landscapes themselves is also fascinating. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I was really happy when I figured out that process, because as I was working on the Playground book and working on Remnants and Revival, I was always shooting landscapes or the sky or something in abstract ways. I knew I wanted to do abstract photography, but I wasn't sure how to do that or what kind or what was going to be successful, because in addition to my 2 photography courses in college, I took the only art course I took was Intro to Art. It was Art History 101. And so that's where I discovered modern painters like Frank Stella and Rothko and Morris Louis and, Barnett Newman and all these, and George O'Keeffe. So I've been in love with modernist paintings, since then. And so I think ever since I've been shooting, since, after college, I've been trying to figure out how can I create photographs that have this feel to them, that are very abstract, but make me happy the way I'm happy when I'm looking at these paintings. And so it took, literally decades for me to get a project that I felt did that in a way that I was happy with. And so there's a lot of projects that are sitting in my hard drive that I'm like, oh, okay, that didn't work. But at least I was working toward it. And one thing that I finally kind of figured out was how important the atmospheric color and light is to me in just my daily life. It's literally why I moved to Colorado from the East Coast. I heard about 360 or 300 and something days of sunshine and blue skies. And I'm just I feel like I'm addicted to blue skies. And so I'm always by the windows, and I'm outside as much as possible. And so I figured, let me think about that as how can I do something photographically with this subject, the sky, that is so interesting to me. But I also at the same time knew that like sunsets are the biggest cliche in color photography there is. So how do you look at atmospheric color and light in a different way? And the Paper Skies project started one day when I was working on a different project, and I was having so much trouble printing it. The blue sky was just not looking like the way I wanted it to look. Then I finally got so frustrated I took the print outside to my deck and held it up to look at the blue sky and the print at the same time to say, okay, what's going on here and how come it doesn't look like what I think it should look like? And that really got me thinking about how we perceive this subject that's ubiquitous. We got this sky around us all the time. How do we perceive that subject differently when it's in a photograph printed on a piece of paper? And how can I play around with that? How can I examine what happens when you print the subject on a piece of paper? So that's where I started comparing the printed sky to the actual sky. And then I noticed as I was holding up the paper, if I held it up at an angle and a shadow was cast on the paper, how that changed my perception of things, or if direct light was hitting it. And so I started playing around with that, and that's how Paper Skies got started.
It's an interesting thing, because one of the things that I really enjoy about this work is that if you just look at it and you don't know what it is that you're looking at, it's a very just aesthetically pleasing experience. There's something about looking at them that's just in just the way that you said, like looking at a Rothko or like a Mondrian or something, where like I might not know exactly what it was that they were trying to do with their paintings, but there's just something that feels very right about it when you look at it. But then when you sort of read the statement and understand the concept behind it, it really sort of deepens the experience. But one of the things that I find kind of a question about that is the question that often seems to come up with when I talk to photographers is, what does it mean if you couldn't look at it and just know without being told, then like, what does that mean for the photography? That doesn't seem to me to always be a very important question, but, and also like, I don't know if if that's necessarily true about this work, whether you couldn't figure it out or whether just I didn't.
No, I think most people can. I mean, they're just optical illusions because of how I crop them. I obviously crop I'm holding up the piece of paper and shoot with one hand, and I have a camera in the other hand, and so I'm shooting it. And when I crop it, obviously I crop out my hand, and so it becomes this optical illusion, and you flattening space, and you're trying to figure out, well, is that what you're looking at? And it is. I think 90% of the people, at least, don't have any idea of what it is they're looking at. I mean, to me, it's very important that it's aesthetically beautiful. It's got to be interesting as well, but the aesthetically beautiful part is really important. So if they don't read the artist statement, or if I'm not there to explain it to them, they can still enjoy it and appreciate it. And, okay, they're told it's photography, and a lot of people think it's painting, or maybe it's Photoshop or something. So, I think that for the general public, it's fine that they don't really understand how it's done. I think it really does add to their appreciation. And I've seen that just by talking to people at exhibits and doing the artist lectures. I think in San Diego, when I did the walkthrough of the museum show, I had the same reaction from the people that were there when I, show them how it's done. They're like, oh my gosh, that's so interesting. That's so cool. So I do think it adds to people's appreciation of it as artwork. And I do get a little frustrated that most times people don't know what they're looking at. I also don't submit this work very much to any online competitions, or I don't like to send it online to a curator I don't know, because it does really sometimes just look like a photoshopped image. And if you don't understand what's behind it, then it's not, I don't think, as interesting to a certain segment of the population, curators and others. But people like it. And, some of them really want to know how it's done. And some people don't really care. They just like it. And that's good enough for them.
Yeah. I think it really works well and speaks well of a work of art when you can engage with it in sort of, multiple approaches, One of the things that I sort of thought was an interesting sort of, parallel between the playground work and this work, which is pretty kind of explicitly called out with the nature, with the title of your museum show, is how there's this element of playfulness to both of them. I really think that, I don't know, play is something that often is sort of, when people use that word, it can be sort of condescending, but I think, there's something to it that is a lot more profound than, and kind of necessary than we might sort of initially grant when we use a word like that, I
do. I mean, I think it can be taken less seriously that, if there's the word play, but I think play also means being creative. I mean, that's what kids do to start with. They're just creative naturally. And for me, taking a playful approach, I'm not sure. I think that works in describing my approach, because what I'm trying to do is look at things in a different way, look at things like maybe in a more, not naive way, but
maybe
try
a more
to find
innocent
something.
way?
Yeah, an innocent way, or just, I mean, these are really I like looking at common subjects in unusual ways. So, when I would be photographing the playgrounds, people would go, well, why are you taking pictures of this rusty slide? Well, especially the early photos of of the playground project were very, very abstract. I was always like lying under the slide or climbing up on top of things to get these very abstract images, because that was an aesthetic that was interesting to me. But I also felt like when you approach it in that way, you get people's attention, because it's a different way of looking at something, and they go, oh, well, maybe that is interesting. Or I've never looked, I've never really, I know I like sunset colors, but I've never really stopped to look at those colors kind of in a different context and understand maybe why they're so appealing or so interesting. So like I said before, for me, photography doesn't, when I'm creating stuff, it doesn't feel like work. The printing and all that other stuff, yeah, that feels like work. But actually making the images doesn't feel like work. It feels like enjoyment or play or just fun.
Yeah. One of the things that I really enjoyed about the modalities sort of segment of this project is that you're taking sort of quote unquote failures and putting them together and creating something new out of them that becomes something that's very much not a failure at all, and I feel like there's a lesson there,
Yeah, I think what happened with that project was when I was shooting the Paper Skies and the subsequent related series called Moving Pictures, I would take so many pictures of this one piece of paper that I would go out and shoot maybe 50 images, and I would be moving the paper around and looking at how the shadows fell in different ways. And as we all know as photographers, that's just the way photographers work. We all take a million pictures, and then we have to go through and edit and figure out which is the one we're going to present to the world. And so I had all these thousands of pictures on my hard drive, and I kept filling up my hard drive, and I was starting to go back and try and delete some of them. And as soon as I started deleting, or I'd maybe deleted a few, but I stopped myself because I'm like, just because this isn't the one that I chose for the final image, these are still really interesting photos. But what was also, I thought, worthwhile in finding a way to work with them was that this work talks about that creative process that all photographers go through, where you're shooting so many images, and then the editing process is just as important as the shooting process. And so by putting these outtakes together, it kind of inferred all the the shooting that goes behind the scenes of producing the one image. And also the other thing that I really enjoy about that series is that it allows me to place color, because it's a lot of times they're grids, or they're what's another word? Not grids. Some of them are grids, but I'm putting together a bunch of different images from one
collages,
shoot.
maybe
Collages or montages, I guess. Yeah. It allows me to place color and shape in a way that I have control of, which makes me feel like it has this dialogue with the modern painting that I love so much, that, like a painter would say, okay, I'm putting this color and this shape here on the canvas. I can say, okay, this is how I'm putting these colors and shapes together into a composition. So I really like the ability to do that in my work.
Well, we should probably take a break and come back and do the second segment.
Okay.
So for the second segment, I always invite the guest to bring a topic of their own, which could be whatever you'd like to talk about, whatever's on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
I would like to talk about portfolio reviews for photographers.
Sounds great. What about them?
Well, it's my friends know me kind of like as the evangelical of portfolio reviews, because I'm always trying to convince people, photographers that haven't done portfolio reviews, to do them, because, they've been instrumental in my career, and I think as photographers, we're so lucky to have them to take advantage of these events. And so, as much as I like talking about the artistic side of things, I also like talking about the practical side of being an artist and being a photographer. And so I have just had a chance to meet amazing photographers, a chance to meet amazing curators, and to get my work out in the world by participating in portfolio reviews. And I think it's something that more photographers, I think they're aware of them, but I'm not sure if they understand exactly how they can help. And so for people that don't know what these portfolio reviews are about, it's where a photographer, there's events every year all over the country, different nonprofit photography organizations put on portfolio reviews where they invite curators and publishers and gallery owners to come for a weekend and sit down with photographers and look at their work. So each photographer, me as a photographer, I can go and I can sign up for maybe 10 portfolio reviews in a weekend, and that means I get a chance to spend 20 minutes each with each of 10 curators or publishers or whoever I choose, and So I have 20 minutes one-on-one with a curator to show them my work, to talk about my work, to get their feedback on my work, and just to get on their radar screen. And I think a lot of photographers who have done kind of critiques and portfolio reviews as part of their MFA program or undergraduate program, they kind of see these portfolio reviews as, a way to have their work critiqued. And at the level that I'm talking about, that's not really the goal anymore. It's to get your work out in the world. And I always tell my friends who are photographers, you could be the best artist. You can be the best photographer, to have this amazing work. If nobody knows that this work exists, how are you going to get it in an exhibit? How are you going to have an opportunity to show it somewhere or get it published? And, maybe it's different for people, artists and photographers who are on maybe in LA or New York, where you have more opportunity to interact with curators. But at the same time, I've seen personally New York photographers who've come out to Colorado to do portfolio reviews, to sit down with New York gallery owners. And they had to come to Colorado because you just don't walk into a gallery and say, can I show you my work? You don't walk into LACMA or SF MoMA or wherever and contact a curator and say, I want to show you my work. And these portfolio reviews are the way to do that. And it's a really, really fantastic opportunity. And I think, as photographers, we're really lucky to have them.
Yeah. I mean, people who have been listening to this show for a while will have heard me mention the Medium Festival like a zillion times already.
Yeah, right.
Because it's like my favorite thing, and it's convenient for me because it happens to be in the same city where I live.
Exactly.
But the number of people that I've met, I mean, even just to be able to do this show, like the number of photographers that I met through that festival is pretty staggering. I think, when you say like, it's not necessarily about getting a critique. I think for me, when I first started out, I went to the first Medium Festival in 2012. And one of the things that really did provide me was because I didn't have an art school background and because I didn't really have an artistic community yet, because I didn't know anybody artistically in San Diego,
right? That
I just didn't have access to be able to have any idea if my work was any good, And so having that first year was a little bit devastating, but just the opportunity to sort of be around people who are all taking the medium seriously and sort of thinking about it in a similar way, at least in terms of, not necessarily that our work is the same, but just that we're all trying to do something with it. That was really valuable for me. I mean, even aside from the sort of networking component of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not that you don't want feedback on your work, especially there's a lot of local portfolio reviews where people that are newer to the field can kind of start off and get feedback on their work and then maybe gear themselves up for some of the bigger reviews. Like Medium Festival is definitely one of my favorite portfolio review events because it's such a great event. It's really professional. It's really friendly and supportive, but they bring in these fabulous curators and other reviewers from all over. And like you said, you meet so many photographers, you meet so many people in the industry, you get to hear a lot about what's going on or how people do things, or you go to lectures as part of the portfolio review weekend event. And it's just, I think, really, really invaluable. And I know it does make people nervous because, especially if you're not quite sure how your work stands up, it's, you have to brace yourself. And I know, I helped the Colorado Photographic Arts Center a few years ago organize their portfolio event when it was the first year that they were bringing in national reviewers instead of just local reviewers. And I was surprised when, the slots were starting to fill up that some of the bigger names weren't the ones that were sold out first. And I was really surprised. And somebody else told me, they're like, oh yeah, I think people are just kind of intimidated. They don't want to sit down with that person. And I can understand that. And so I think it's for someone who's in that situation, if they want to start with the smaller local reviews that can build up their confidence and get them more used to talking about their work. I think that's always a good idea. But I also think there's a lot of value for people who are more advanced to do the big ones like PhotoFest. And I mean, I've heard great things about Photolucida and Photonola. And I did Palm Springs portfolio reviews a couple times. And that was really helpful because that was really early in my career. And I went out to that specifically because they had a lot of publishing industry reviewers. And I was working on the Playground project, and I had just decided that maybe it would make a good book. So I took my photos and I took my Playground catalogs out to that. And that was my first real portfolio review. And I showed it to people in the industry, in the publishing industry, and I said, do you think this would make a good book project? And it was so important to me that they said yes. I mean, they loved the idea of this as a book. And so I knew that confirmed what I was thinking, that, okay, this work is good, it's interesting, and it could make a good book. And that was extremely important at that stage in my career. But especially being in Colorado, you know, Denver's great, but if I want to get on, and I always say I want to get on the radar screen. You can't expect things to happen right away, but if people like my work, if they may include it in the show at some point in the future, but they're not going to do that if they don't know it exists. So since I'm in Colorado, I'll go out to New York, I'll go out to California, wherever I think the right portfolio review is, to just get my work on people's radar screens. And then you just have to wait and see what happens. Yeah.
Yeah. That is one thing that I think some people go into these events sort of expecting to get offered something right away, which it really very rarely happens. But, but just being able to sort of meet with people and get a feel for what they're into and get, like one of the people that I have had review my work several times now is Aline Smithson of Lens Scratch. And
love her.
She's great.
Yes.
And, you know, I've since, you know, really probably because of the fact that she's reviewed my work a couple of times now, that really because of that, you know, we've become friends. And, you know, she eventually, not the first year certainly, but, you know, eventually she offered me a couple of features on Lens Scratch. But it's the kind of thing where it's really sort of developing a relationship with these people that you're meeting. You know, a lot of people call them sort of like speed dating for art, because really, there's only so much you can get into in 20 minutes, but just having the opportunity to even just to be able to follow up later is really great.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's how I got the museum show in San Diego. I had met Ariel Plotek, who's the curator of modern and contemporary art at the museum, at a portfolio review at Medium Festival in 2014. And he really, really liked my work, and which was wonderful because the abstract work was really brand new. It was the first time I was showing it. And so he really liked it. And what I did was I followed up over the next 2 years. I made an effort to get to San Diego. My husband was going out there on business. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to go out for a couple of days and mooch off of your hotel room. Cause I want to keep in contact with some of the people I met at the portfolio review. And so I met Ariel again. We had coffee and I just kind of updated him on what was going on. And then I was back in San Diego a year later and emailed Ariel and said, hey, I'm back in town, want to have coffee. I'd love to show you how the work has evolved. And so I met him again, and I wasn't really expecting anything at that point. And he offered me a chance to show my work at the museum, and which was ridiculously exciting for me. So it takes time, but you just have to keep following up and getting your name and your work out there, and eventually the dots start connecting. You know, now I know I went to the New York Times portfolio review, which is something people can look into because it's free. I mean, you can apply for it right now. It's hard to get in, but it's free. And especially for editorial photographers, it would be fabulous. And I went to that a couple years ago, and I happened to sit down with one reviewer I knew, and there was another person sitting down with him that I didn't even know, and that ended up turning into another unexpected opportunity. You just don't know how things are going to work out. The more people you meet and talk to and show your work to, I think the better your odds are of something happening.
Yeah. And the point that you made before too about even when you're at sort of a more advanced level, that that these things are still really valuable, is something, I found myself kind of surprised about, at times in the past, like even speaking of like Aline, right, who is a very well-known, both photographer in her own right and just member of the photographic community because of Lens Scratch. Like, I feel like everybody in Photoland knows about Aline.
Right.
But she still goes to portfolio reviews to present her own work as well. Like, I think last year or the year before, she took some new work to review Santa Fe. And it's just for exactly that reason that, like, if it's new work, then you have to do something to get it out there. And the portfolio review really does, give you that opportunity that, it's sort of one of the things that I always think about, because I try to do things as both a photographer and as a writer. And I feel like in a lot of ways, writing has a more sort of straightforward process to, like, how to get published has sort of a process to it that is a little more established than how it works for visual arts.
Right.
But the photo portfolio review sort of is as close as that as you get in visual arts as what you have with writing,
Yeah, I do. I definitely believe that. And I have heard several people say over the years, well, I don't like portfolio reviews because it's pay to play. It's not pay to play. It's investing in your career. I mean, most of the reviewers are not getting paid. They're having their travel expenses reimbursed, but they're there to learn about new work and support artists. And yes, it does get expensive. If I have to fly out to San Diego and stay at a hotel and, buy meals and rent a car, whatever, it's $2,000. And I'm very fortunate that I can afford that. And I know there are artists that can't afford that. But if you can, it's got to be seen as a real investment in your career, because you have to let people know your work exists. Otherwise, I don't even know how, like, sculptors or painters get on the radar screens unless you have a gallery in New York or a gallery, and then how do you get a gallery? How do you show your work unless you're in New York and you have an MFA thesis show and people hear about you? I really don't know how other artists get on the radar screen, which is why I think I appreciate even more the portfolio reviews. And I have seen, even in a lot, I would say 99% of the cases, it is this long-term thing. I've also been at portfolio reviews where publishers like Nezreli Press picked up a new book project for an artist that was right next to me. And I've also been at a review recently in Denver where a New York area photographer came to Colorado to the Denver portfolio reviews and met with a New York gallerist who ended up picking him up, representing him. But even though they're both from New York, it's like I said, you can't just walk in and have time or opportunity to show some of these people your work. Portfolio reviews allow that to happen, and on a very equal, level, because the reviewers know they're there to help you, or at least to give you suggestions and give you feedback, even if they can't put you in an exhibit or do something else. And so I find, that scenario a lot better than trying to show my work to other people on my own.
Yeah. I think that the pay to play argument is really, I feel like that there is an argument in the photography world, that there are pay to play elements. I don't think of portfolio reviews in that way. I tend to think of it more as like some of the competitions, and some of the sort of more like community members only kind of gallery spaces can be a little pay to play ish.
Yeah.
I really don't think portfolio reviews really fall under that. I do think that there's an interesting conversation to have about, obviously there are people making worthwhile work out there who can't afford thousands of dollars, and that's unfortunate. But
There are so many now. There's so many portfolio reviews around the country that you could probably find a really good one to drive to, and stay on a friend's couch or stay at an Airbnb for a couple of days. And that's one of the reasons the Colorado Photographic Arts Center decided to start bringing in these national reviewers every 2 years to their month of photography that happens in March, because there is so much great talent in Denver and great photographers, and a lot of them don't have the money to travel around the country to meet with these curators. So they decided, well, let's kind of up the game and bring these curators and show them how much, local talent there is. And they kept the price very reasonable. It was like $35 for each meeting. And so for a couple $100, the photographers had a chance to really kind of get their work out there. So I think for people that are interested, there are probably ways of, and actually now a bunch of the portfolio reviews offer scholarships too.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. So the last question that I like to ask everybody before we finish is whether there's a piece of art or literature or just general creativity that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
I went to the Denver Art Museum maybe a month and a half ago. They do lectures with visiting photographers every so often. And Alison Rossiter was there and talking about her work with expired photographic paper. And I just found it so interesting because I'm always really intrigued by photographers who do something really, really different than what everybody else is doing. And so she had this huge collection of photo paper back to the 1800s. I mean, she had samples. Wow. And she develops them without exposing them. I mean, she just uses developing chemicals to create forms mostly on the paper and these abstract images. And they're beautiful. They're very abstract, so I love them. But it was so inspiring to see someone take a completely new approach to something and really make something beautiful and interesting out of it. And and she has got this beautiful new book that just came out. I think it's Aperture book, with all her images from that series, and I bought 2 copies because I liked it so much. I don't know what I'm going to do with the second one. I'm going to hold on to it for a while, but it was just I loved it. So that was very inspiring.
Cool. Wow. Thanks so much for talking with me. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Okay, so as I mentioned at the top of the show, there are links in the show notes to where you can purchase a copy of Brenda's book, Once Upon a Playground. And if today's conversation interested you, I do recommend picking up a copy. And that is our show. If you'd like to get in touch, you can find all of the show's contact and social media info in the show notes. If you'd like to support the show, a monthly pledge in any amount to our Patreon campaign is greatly appreciated. You can find that at patreon.com/SakeRiver. That's sake like the drink and river like river. Our theme music is by Poddington Bear. You can find more of his music available for licensing at soundofpicture.com. We will be back on March 14th with a conversation with science fiction author Ty Frank, so be sure to come back for that one. Until then, remember, keep the channel open.